Well, you can see that today is Bishop Guerry Sunday. And some of you know what that means. Others of you may not be familiar with it. And so we'll talk about what this day is all about. It was 15 years ago today, June 9th, because June 9th is the day that Bishop Guerry died in 1928. So 15 years ago today, Tom Tisdale, who would become, again for the second time, the chancellor of our diocese in a few years after that, Michael Wright, and I, the three of us walked from Grace Church over to the churchyard at St. Philip's. We went to Bishop Guerry's grave. We lit 3 candles, said prayers, and thanked God for the witness of Bishop Guerry. And so the celebration, that's how saints are always recognized locally. And so that's what we were doing. We were recognizing our local martyr and saint. In the year 1928, Bishop Guerry, who was the 8th bishop of our diocese, was in his office at St. Philip's Church. We didn't have a cathedral in those days, and so the office of the bishop was at St. Philip's. That made sense. It was the mother church. And a priest took a train from Savannah to Charleston and showed up at the bishop's office unannounced. The bishop had, a day or two before, had been out here on John's Island. He'd been here at St. John's, where he had confirmed and preached and presided. And that was the last sacramental act that he performed as the bishop of our diocese, was here at St. John's. And he was planning to catch the train to Cayuga, and he was going to meet his wife and some other family. They'd been attending a graduation at Sewanee, and so they were coming over by train from Sewanee. Those were the days when you could catch the train to these places and not have to drive. I'd be going there all the time to both of those places. But anyway, so that was the plan. He went to his office just to tidy up and tie up some loose ends, and this priest showed up. And the priest years earlier had written a 45-page diatribe against some proposals of Bishop Guerry for our diocese, which had to do with racial inclusion. And so this priest, he ended up really struggling later. He was down in Georgia, the coast of Georgia, where he was supplying at a couple of places. And the truth is, he was struggling physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually. Because when you're consumed by racial hatred, things do begin to break down. So, consumed still, after many years with racial hatred, he took the train to Savannah. He took the train from Savannah to Charleston, and he would never leave the bishop's office. He would shoot the bishop, and then he would turn the gun on himself. He died instantly. Bishop Guerry would linger for about 5 days, and he finally died on June the 9th, 1928, in Roper Hospital. And before he died, he asked about the priest, and he said, "Poor man, pray for him. He did not know what he was doing." And so this is a story. We remember this story because this is our legacy here in South Carolina. Our legacy is one of breadth. It's one of courage. It's one of going against the grain. It's one of strength. Bishop Guerry simply believed that the church ought to be broad enough to embrace within its communion, these are his words, if we are to be Catholic as Christ himself is Catholic, we must have a church broad enough to embrace within its communion every living human soul. Period. He also, in addition to wanting to have a black suffragan bishop, there was a program in the church. It was just it wasn't the best of options, but it was a means of beginning to open up. Because in those days, the different conventions, there was a convention for the black members of the diocese and a convention for the white members. So there was no integration. And so this was a beginning. He was wanting to reach out pastorally to the many black members of his diocese. And so in addition to that, there was this little school in Denmark, South Carolina. And you've heard me say this before, but Denmark, South Carolina is located not far from Norway, Finland, and Sweden, South Carolina. And so there was this little technical school in Denmark, and it kind of followed the various models elsewhere in the South. And so it was Bishop Guerry who said, we want to bring you, if you're willing, we want to bring you what would become Voorhees College, ultimately, and now university. We want to bring you under the fold of the Episcopal Church. And Voorhees is still, today, I have the privilege of serving on the board there and have for a few years. It's one of the historically black colleges and universities that is tied to the Episcopal Church. And so that too, those two stances, wanting to educate young black children and wanting to open the church up to everyone, that would get the bishop killed. And so this was in 1928. There was national news about this, that South Carolina had a bishop who was murdered by a priest. But as is often the case, these kinds of difficult stories, they end up going underground, don't they? They're buried. And I wonder sometimes, maybe the burying of these stories isn't necessarily intentional. Maybe we just don't know what to do. Maybe we don't have the language to talk about these things, and it's so oppressive and so difficult. I don't really know. But at any rate, the story went underground. And the story, when it was told about the fact that we had a bishop who was murdered, what was always said was, the bishop was shot by a priest who was deranged. Deranged. That was it. And I think that prevented, that word deranged, that prevented any further discussion. And it may well have been that he was deranged. I'm not arguing that. But again, that's what racial hatred will do to one, isn't it? So today we honor and remember Bishop Guerry. And I think for us here at St. John's, it's particularly poignant, not only because this was the last place where Bishop Guerry, where he functioned sacramentally and ministered sacramentally to his flock, but also that one of his sons, he and his wife had 5 children. A daughter ended up in Colombia, and she and her husband ended up having summer camps for children near Canuga. And then he had a son, Alexander, who became the vice chancellor, president of the University of the South. His other 3 sons were Sumner, who was a priest, who was a missionary in China, and then Moultrie was another son who was a priest, and he served in Virginia. And then there was Edward Brailsford Guerry, who was the very long time rector of this parish. And so people like me grew up knowing that we had a bishop who was the father of our priest, who was murdered, but we didn't know the story necessarily. And so this is a book that Edward, our former rector, Edward compiled of the bishop's sermons, some essays that he wrote, and we had a wonderful time in Sunday school talking about the theology, really delving into the theology and the ecclesiology of Bishop Guerry, the way he thought about God and the church. And so just a couple of years ago, we reprinted, this was out of print, this was out of print, so we reprinted another edition. We have this available. And then Tom Tisdale wrote a play back in 2013 that premiered at the Dock Street Theater 10 years ago this summer. And I understand that there's a group up at Good Shepherd Sumter that's going to have some sort of showing of the play production next Sunday afternoon. But anyway, what I want to do right now is just give you a few of the bishop's words. I want you to hear him in his own words. He says this: "It is a person, not a dogma, that invites our faith. It is a person, not a code of ethics, that claims our love. It is not the doctrine nor the ethics of Christianity that have proved themselves so irresistibly attractive. It is the life and character of Christ." He then talks about unity. He says we should strive for unity, not uniformity. And that when we come to Christ, we come as members of a family. It's why I'm with the people, that yes, I love to find God out at the beach or in the woods or in a sunset. I see God there all the time. In the resurrection fern, that's my sermon. That's my one sermon that if I have one, it's about resurrection fern. I'm a big believer in all of that. So I don't take away from that. At the same time, why are we here today on a muggy, warm June day, listening to me and worshiping the Lord and receiving the sacrament? We're here because you're here because you know the value of community, that it's important for us to be together. Christ's body, we don't come to Christ by ourselves. And so he says this: God seeks to save us not as separated individuals, but as members of a family, a society, a kingdom of God. And so he said some pretty radical things too. I think we tend to think of South Carolina as being all conservative all the time, and in our recent past. And here's what he said, and this would be in the early, probably the 19-teens, the 1920s as well. He says, "No religion can survive which is not capable of adapting itself to restatement and reinterpretation in the light of the science and philosophy of the day. It has been the glory of Christianity that from the beginning it has shown itself capable of change and development." And then he said this: "The church has no more dangerous foe to combat than the spirit of ultra-conservatism, which allows her clergy and leaders to get out of sympathetic touch with and understanding of the times in which we live." You notice that there was this unabashed stance for truth, and he said something. He said this about truth. He said, "Truth is not something finished and mechanical. Truth is organic and living. And so what he's really saying is, and for me as a young priest, when the walls were beginning to close in, and I had older priests from other places saying, Callie, you better get out of that diocese. You better get out of South Carolina as fast as you can get. I mean, that was the prevailing message to me by really wise clergy that I cared very much for, and I knew cared for me. That's why hearing the words of Bishop Guerry made me realize there isn't anywhere else I want to be. Because this is our legacy. This is who we are. And he said this too: our high calling under God is to burn away the barriers which divide us, to allay prejudice, to strengthen the ties which bind brother to brother and section to section, and to make of this great land one free people. He was born in 1861. I mean, he was a product of his day. He may have marched in a parade. He may not have. I don't know. But he wasn't somebody who was simply talking the talk. He was walking the walk. And in the day of decision for him, he stood for what he believed was the Catholicity of the church. That is the breadth of the church. If we're to be Catholic, universal, if we're to be Catholic as Christ himself is Catholic, then we must be open and welcoming to everyone. And the unity of Christ's family, the church, and of the individual soul with Christ and through his church is the central doctrine of the New Testament. Unity, not uniformity. So one of the things he also said, because we talked about this in the adult class, is so what for today? What is he saying for us today? Well, here's what he said about that. He said, if we take a backward glance today, it is only that we may gain fresh courage and strength for the future and the great work to which God has called us. And Bishop Gaylor of Tennessee preached at the Diocesan Convention at St. John's, Florence, the year, just a few months after Bishop Guerry died. And he said this to the people of South Carolina. He said, he is with us still. He is praying for us and with us. And that's part of what you always hear me talking about, the great cloud of witnesses, that we are never alone, and those who have gone before are with us still. And so the work that we're called to do today, which is a work of restoration that's going to be a years-long effort, wonderfully so, we have the likes of Bishop Guerry and his son, who have taught us well, and whom we can depend upon to meet whatever challenges we face in our own day. And for that, we can say thanks be to God. So may we be open. May we be open to the Spirit of God working within us. There may be something brand new that the Lord is calling you to do that you've not even considered. What might that be? The Spirit of God is moving here. That I know. How is the Spirit of God moving within you? Prompting you, prodding you, beckoning you. A spirit of love, of generosity, of hospitality and welcome, as well as worship. If we take a backward glance today, it is only that we may gain fresh courage and strength for the work to which we are called today. Amen.